Hello BookTube, I'm back with you today to talk about Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. This is of course not Girl, Woman, Other, this is my Kobo e-reader, but I read it as an ebook, so I'll put a picture of the cover over there. And Girl, Woman, Other, it's been discussed already quite a bit on BookTube. Of course it won last year's Booker Prize together with The Testaments. And I read it 2 months ago now as part of my monthly book club. Or one of the monthly book clubs I'm in, I should say. And I know there's been some mixed reception on BookTube, especially Books by Leynes had a very scathing review. She did not like it at all, and I'll link to that down below if you want an alternative view, because I quite enjoyed the book myself, although there also had some points of criticism. And I think they kind of tie into the whole idea of this book being a novel, because it didn't really feel like a novel. It felt much more like a set of connected short stories. So one book I felt was somewhat similar is Renton Mystery's book Tales from Ferocia Bag. This is really marketed as a collection of short stories where all the people in the short story are interconnected by all living in the same apartment building. So each short story in here, apartment building Mumbai I should add, but each short story in here focuses on one or a small number of characters that live in one of these apartments in the apartment block, and occasionally the characters appear in each other's stories because of course they are all neighbors. And Bernadine Evaristo does something similar in Girl, Woman, Other, where she gives us a number of short stories discussing the lives and experiences of black women in Britain throughout different generations, covering most of the 20th and early 21st centuries. And I think it's short story collection is almost a better word for it. So it is marketed as a novel, and there are some connections between these people. So a number of the short stories are connected because they're different generations from the same family. But the rest of the characters are really connected by them attending this one play, which is kind of the framework narrative of the novel, that this play is taking place and we get a scene at the beginning and at the end of the novel at this play. But other than that, there's very little connection between the stories. So as a short story collection, so I feel it's much more of a short story collection rather than a novel. Right? A novel that has similar structure, well, of course, there are many kind of these family epics, but especially one is The Old Drift by Namali Sherpal, where we look at the history of Zambia through the lives of different generations of Zambians. And so this novel is divided up in different sections where we follow different characters representing different aspects of the experience of being Zambian, let's say. And so Girl, Woman, Other tries to do something similar, but then for Britain, and especially for what it has meant to be a black woman in Britain and the different experiences people have had. So one of the, I don't know if it's pitfalls, one of the things that can happen when you're doing that is that each character in your novel has to become kind of symbolic, right? They're not just one person, but they symbolize a particular aspect of this kind of overall experience you're trying to capture, right? Because of course, you know, being a black British woman is not just one thing. There's many different ways you could have experienced that depending on your exact circumstances. And so by having these different characters in different chapters, Bernadine Evaristo is trying to capture these differences in experience. But of course you only have 12 people in your novel, not millions, so everyone has to become somewhat symbolic. And then the danger is that the person becomes a symbol rather than a human character, and it depends a bit on your personal preference how well you like that or not. So I would say I'm a bit more on board for characters who are symbols usually, and so I wasn't too bothered by it in this book. And also I must say in this book, although the characters are kind of representing a whole chunk of experience rather than just one person, I think Evaristo did a good job of making each character an individual as well, and not just a cipher or an insert. Having said that, we did get very little time with each character, and that meant I didn't really feel fully invested. Also, I can't quite put my finger on it, but somehow the story structure kind of made, I kind of already knew where the character was going to end up, and there was no tension as to whether they would achieve their goals or not. and that kind of took away a sense of urgency, right? That was kind of, I wasn't, curious or anxious to wonder, what would happen to this character, because I already kind of knew how it would turn out. And, and I don't mind spoilers, right? I don't mind stories where I already know the ending, but then there should be kind of a tension of how that ending is going to be achieved. And that was missing for me as well. And so it was almost, obviously it's a fictional account, but it was almost a non-fiction book where you kind of, exploring a period of history through zooming in on the lives of particular people, except in this case, of course, these particular people are fictional, although I'm sure a lot of it is based on kind of real life experiences people have had. So that made it kind of difficult to me. So I enjoyed it as kind of a very human way of showing me a set of experiences that I knew very little about, and aspect of history I knew very little about. But then as a novel, it didn't quite work, both because I think it's more a set of short stories than a novel, and because I didn't feel the kind of set of real tension or I don't want to say empathy, because that's not correct. I felt empathy for the characters, but a sense of connectedness and of striving with them and hoping with them for a certain outcome. That was lacking to me. And so then the interesting thing is, so that was my opinion. So overall, good book, but some flaws which kept it from being an all-time favorite. But then it's interesting that, of course, it did win the Booker Prize. So, what do I think about that? And then that's maybe a nice segue into a slightly different discussion of these kind of book prizes. Because if you look at the Booker Prize website, it kind of just says it's for the best novel. But there's very little articulation of what it means to be the best novel, right? So there's a set of judges each year, and then they get to pick a novel which they think is the best novel of that year, and then that's it. And so it is what I'm kind of missing is discussion around that of how should we define best and what aspects should or shouldn't we take into account. Right? And maybe this is heightened because I just took a course on how to design assessments for students, right? And if I'd written down, well, the best student gets a 10, that would not fly in such a course, right? But for a lot of these literary prizes, and I'm picking the Booker now because, of course, Go Woman Other won the Booker, but a lot of these prizes, we have the same issue where the prize is awarded to the best book, but there's no real definition of what best means. Right? And of course there's an element of subjectivity to this, right? But it will be an interesting discussion to have, like, what do we mean by best? And then we can discover that maybe we mean different things or the same things, and we can go from there. And one thing, of course, especially came up with Go Woman Other was an aspect of the prize the subject matter, that this was a book about British women, and therefore it's politically correct to award the prize to this book. And of course, especially if there are parts of the book that didn't appeal to you, and I've named some things that didn't appeal to me, it's kind of an easy charge to make, and that's a charge that's often made when we see diverse voices entering a new area, that the book only won because of diversity or political correctness or affirmative action, whatever you want to call it. And so then, and then the charge often made is, there are some particular flaws of the book, but it won anyway because of political correctness. But the question we have to ask is it in fact not legitimate to take into account the content and the purpose of the book, right? Because if you think of the classics, right, Pride and Prejudice would not be the classic it is now if it wasn't also a satire of contemporary English society. Right? Dickens wouldn't be the classic he is now if he wasn't also making a very real political point about the lives of poor people. Right? Even the Iliad and the Odyssey have very particular things to say about war, right? And people have changed over the centuries in interpreting what exactly it's saying about war, but in my reading, for example, the Iliad is not at all a favor of war and doesn't think much of the so-called glories of war, even as its heroes are glorified. So, is it really that illegitimate to take into account what a book is about and to say, we live in a period where we're recognizing that the lives and experiences of certain people and groups of society have been excluded, have been systematically not recorded, or actively even erased in some cases, from our understanding. And here is a book that is bringing these experiences to us in a good way. And even if there are some flaws to this book, and of course there are flaws to the book, and no book is perfect, right? I'm sure you can pick out things, and even William Shakespeare is regarded as the greatest playwright ever by many. There are plenty of people that have legitimate criticisms of all kinds of things going on in Shakespeare. So the mere fact that a book is flawed, I don't think, that doesn't mean you can't still award a prize to that book, and that doesn't mean that the content and those flaws might be offset by the fact that what the book is doing, the point the book is making, is strong and important enough that we can overlook those flaws. Right? And especially if you're just saying, we awarded a prize to the best novel, and you don't have no specific criteria what you mean by best, I think what the book is doing adds to, if the book is doing that well, is something you can take into account when you're considering whether the book is good or not. And especially in a time that we see now, where we see that, there's huge problems with racism. We've seen police violence in the US, but it's all over the world. Just the US is the most visible at the moment. And racism is a very big, complicated topic, but part of what goes into racism and makes racism is, a lack of seeing other people as fully human, and of knowing and understanding their experiences from their points of view. So the fact that a book can help do that, I think, is something you definitely should take into account, and is very legitimate to take into account when awarding a prize. And it's not just awarding a prize because of political correctness, but it's recognizing the importance of the book and what the book is doing in the broader conversation, if that's the right word, we're having at the moment. So in that sense, I'm not a Booker Prize judge. I haven't read the entire long list, and I certainly don't intend to. But I think it's selling the book short to say it just won just because of PC-ness. And in the end, it wasn't a 5-star read for me, but I do very much appreciate what the book was trying to do, and I think I gained a lot from having read it. So those are my thoughts on Go On Other, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, whether you agree with me or not, in the comments down below, and let's discuss it further. Bye bye.